My wife, she just goes crazy. She's from New Jersey. She's not that much out there. Yeah. Yeah, no. When I go to the school, it's insane. All those big curves. My kids are so late. I wanted them to risk cross-breeding and go to school.
And I carry entirely too many in my purse.
Quite a few cans of fish this year.
Right. Yeah, Rachel. My daughter got some extra hours in January. In fact, she stays on, so they were like worried. No public transit, so she just stayed overnight. So she was there.
I actually met.
How far away is she?
She's not that far. It's coming up maybe 4 hours. From like Lawrence and but she does normally take the metro.
Yeah, I guess people watch the plot movies. He's kind of really managed to come across extremely hard.
Everybody's quiet, so I think we can start. Welcome to the Institute for the Humanities. I'm Susan Levine, the director, and we're happy to have you here today for David Hilbert's lecture. Before we start, I have a few announcements. Our next lecture will be our dissertation fellow, Ryan Brooks, from the Department of English. That will be on Tuesday, February 25th at 3 o'clock. And Ryan will speak on Super NAFTA versus El Gran Mojado, the alternative fictional realities and the fight for free trade. And on Tuesday, March 4th, Cedric Johnson, our fellow from the Department of Political Science and African American Studies, will speak on Between Revolution and the Racial Ghetto, Harold Cruz and Harry Haywood debate class struggle and the Negro question, 1962 to 1968. And I also want to announce that this year's visiting fellow at the Institute will be Richard White from the Department of History and the Spatial History Lab at Stanford University. And Professor White will be giving a public lecture on Wednesday, April 2nd at 4 o'clock on California time. He's looking at issues of time and space, and especially in the American West. And on Thursday, April 3rd, from 3 to 5, he'll do a seminar down here at the Institute entitled Visualizing Narratives. And he will circulate some small readings for that, which will be available on our website.
Yeah, one's already up.
They're already up on our website. So if you'd like to come to the lecture, please do. And if you'd like to attend the seminar, that's also open. But we do like people to respond just so we know how many to expect. But we hope you'll all come for those. And now I would like to ask one of our former fellows, John Whipple, to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Sue. It's my pleasure to introduce David Hilbert, Professor of Philosophy and member of the Laboratory of Integrative Neuroscience. David received his PhD in philosophy at Stanford with a dissertation titled The Objectivity of Color. Before he came to UISC, David taught at Yale and the California Institute of Technology, and he's also been a visiting professor at Princeton, University of Chicago, and Australian National University. Most of David's research has been focused on philosophy of perception and the nature of color. Shortly after completing his dissertation, he published his first book, Color and Color Perception, a study in anthropocentric realism. David has since published many articles in leading journals, including Philosophical Studies, philosophy of science, philosophical topics, behavior and brain sciences, and philosophical issues. Some of these articles have been translated into French and German. He's also contributed articles to collections of essays published by top presses, such as Oxford and MIT. He co-edited 2 books on color, one containing philosophical writings on color, the other scientific writings. And Oxford University Press will soon be publishing a collection of some of his most important essays, co-authored with Alex Byrne, professor of philosophy at MIT. David's work on the philosophy of perception and color has been very influential. He's widely regarded as one of the leading philosophers of perception in the world. You might be tempted to assume, given that very brief overview of some of David's most important research, that he wouldn't have much time for graduate students. But really nothing could be further from the truth. David has directed and advised a number of different students over the years at UIC on a remarkable range of topics. I'll list some of the dissertations that he's directed briefly in recent years. Theories of experiential awareness, a theory of perceptual entitlement, personal autonomy, oppression, the just society, an externalist account, a new cognitive theory of the emotions, choosing to be harmed, autonomy and its limits in living organ donor transplantation, conceptual analysis of ecosystem health, the phenomenal character of visual consciousness, and he's also directing some dissertations in progress right now on causation in biology, dual process theories of action, and aesthetic criticism and aesthetic reasoning. What's particularly striking about this list, besides just its length, and it's not a complete list, is this really impressive range of dissertations that David has been involved with that go far beyond anything related to the philosophy of perception, touching on these feminist theories of autonomy, environmental ethics, medical ethics, and some other areas. So David has really been amazing when it comes to his contribution to the success of our graduate students at UIC, and given those efforts, it's not at all a surprise that David was awarded the Graduate College's Graduate Mentoring Award the first year that it was offered. But that's not all. So back to the research. Now, although David spent most of his career focused on philosophy of perception, he also has deep and abiding interests in the history of philosophy. His strongest passion is for the works of Bishop George Berkeley, a famous 18th century Irish philosopher. David has edited an edition of one of Berkeley's most famous works, Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous, and he's currently writing the volume on Berkeley for the Rutledge Philosopher series with Lisa Downing, professor of philosophy at Ohio State. David has gone to great lengths in his contextually sensitive research on Berkeley, including numerous visits to the Whitehall Museum, which was Berkeley's Rhode Island residence from 1729 to 1731 when he was trying to found a college in Bermuda. He also spent an afternoon finding the beach with overhanging rocks that Berkeley describes in Alciphron, which was his defense of the Christian religion. They did note that his communing with Berkeley was slightly impaired by a group of drunken high school students, but not much you can do about that. And finally, although he wasn't able to convince his family to trek to Cloyne, where Berkeley served as bishop, he did force them to hike through a cow pasture to look at a ruined tower that may have once been attached to the house that Berkeley grew up in. But on more serious notes, in some ways, David's interest in Berkeley is not surprising. Berkeley's first important work was, after all, an essay towards a new theory of vision, something that obviously is right up David's alley. But he's interested in all of Berkeley's writings and pursuits, as his contextual pursuits just mentioned would suggest, and not just Berkeley's famous writings in epistemology and metaphysics, which have received a great deal of attention in the secondary literature, but also his less well-known works on religion, mathematics, economics, education, and believe it or not, even some tracts on the virtues of tar water, which you may get to. Berkeley also composed some poetry, among other things. Now, some of these texts and writings that seem very far removed from these kind of core philosophical issues that have really excited people over the years just have not received very much attention in the secondary literature. And Dave's current research suggests, he's trying to make the case, that that's really a mistake, that it's important to look at all the things that Berkeley has written. And if we do that, we'll actually see that Berkeley is pursuing a single overarching project throughout his entire life. Very simply stated, the overarching project is to make people happy. And this big project, Dave claims, is the driving force behind all of his work, even the work that might seem very far removed from any direct concern with human welfare. So I think David's work really promises to give us a better understanding of Berkeley's works as a whole, and also, I think, a better understanding of some of those classic works that people have been struggling with and talking about since they were written. Today, he's giving us a talk on this current research, and it's called Berkeley's Political Metaphysics, Immaterialism, and Social Change. Please join me in welcoming David Hilbert.
Okay, well, thanks, John, for that generous introduction. As far as what I'm going to do today, I'm going to put the emphasis on that word promise, because I think I'm not quite there yet. And unfortunately, although there is a place for tar water in the project, I'm not going to talk about that today. But I'd be happy to entertain questions in the discussion. I also want to thank the Institute for my time here, which I've enjoyed immensely. I don't know if I put it to good use, but after 30 years of being one of the foremost experts on the trivia of color science and philosophy, I now think I'm well on my way to playing that same role with regard to Barclay. So anyway, oh, and we'll see about the title. I'm not totally convinced that I'm really going to actually make good on the title. But anyway, so here's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to start with some background. The way to think about the background is some elementary biographical facts and stuff like that. That's just like a placeholder for the real context that I'm not going to actually have time to give you here. That's just like hand-waving to show I know it matters, and I do think it matters. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific economic event that happened in early 18th century Great Britain, and the response of Berkeley to that event, which provoked him both to write an interesting and in some ways important pamphlet, and also to engage in a chaotic project that I will describe in more detail, the Bermuda Project. Then I'm going to talk about some of Berkeley's economic writings and his response to what he saw as the problems of the Irish economy once he became a bishop in the 1730s. So, and then at the end, I'm going to come back to the stuff that I really actually mostly care about, which is the crucial early works on metaphysics and epistemology, and I'm going to try and set those in the context of discussion of these other episodes. So chronologically, it doesn't make sense. I'm going to take the earliest stuff last, but the idea is to try to kind of provide a context in which you can now see the early works in a new light. And then I'm going to make some hand-wavy conclusion. That's okay. So background. Oh, and this is Berkeley. This is derived. Berkeley. There's a lot of portraits of Berkeley, but they all are mostly based on a very small number of starting places. Many of them are actually derived from a single painting by a guy named Jan Smyber, including the only portrait of Berkeley that UC Berkeley actually has, which is a 19th century painting, and they made a big deal about this historical piece, but Berkeley had been dead over 100 years by the time this was painted, so the guy was just looking at other paintings when he made his painting. But there was no representation of Berkeley at Berkeley until the last decade, so they've been slow to acknowledge their debt to the great philosopher, which I will talk about briefly. Okay, so Berkeley was Anglo-Irish. He was oppressive colonial class, right? So roughly 75–80% of the population of Ireland was Catholic, and of those, the overwhelming majority were what we'll call indigenous Irish, although that includes some Norman settlers who'd become, as it were, assimilated to the Irish. But Berkeley his family was part of a much more recent immigration of English Protestants to Ireland to basically run the place. And you want to think about it, it was a colony not quite in the sense that the American colonies were colonies, but more in the way of India or South Africa, where there was a small class of immigrants who, as it were, monopolized wealth and power to a very substantial degree. And just to finish that thought, in Berkeley's time, Catholics were essentially forbidden to own land, they couldn't hold public office, they couldn't vote, they weren't allowed in the colleges, and dissenting Protestants were treated almost but not quite as badly. And this will become relevant later. He was educated at Kilkenny College, which was an Anglican kind of school for youngish people. That's more or less where he went to high school. The ages they did things were different then. And then he went off to Trinity College, Dublin. And just to give you a sense of what kind of education that was, these were the same schools that Jonathan Swift, his slightly older contemporary, went to. So this was the education typical of the elite in Ireland at that time. So, although his family was obscure, not noble, not rich, his dad was some kind of tax collector, about whom very little is known. But he was part of this educated elite. And then he had this amazing burst of philosophical creativity. And we know, because he kept notebooks, Berkeley left very few drafts, but he left a pair of notebooks and actually the draft preface to the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. But we know the notebooks, he had most of the central philosophical ideas for which he is now currently known while he was in his late teens. He's a little like Hume in that regard. And all three of these books, which are the books for which he's most remembered now, were published while he was still in his 20s. So there's an essay towards the new theory of vision, a fundamental contribution to how we think about vision, which really was taken very seriously in the sciences up until the 20th century. Science has moved on in many ways now. The treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, that was his first explanation of his core ideas in metaphysics and epistemology. And then the three dialogues, which is an attempt to re-express those ideas in a format that would make them more accessible to the educated reading public. By the way, that attempt was a complete failure. A nice dissertation on the early reception of Barclays and Immaterialism, and really there's very little evidence anybody even read it. But many people knew of it and ridiculed it. But from the way in which they ridicule it, you can trace almost all of it back to a single review. Berkeley, as was really necessary for the ambitious young Anglo-Irish intellectual, went off to London in 1713. You really couldn't make a successful career if you never left Ireland. You had to go off to the metropolitan capital and make your reputation there. The title here, this is a line from a poem by Pope, who became a friend of Barclay's while he was in London. And by the way, it's the surviving remarks about Berkeley are all of this flavor. Everybody seemed to really like the guy. He seems to have been a really nice man. There's some other one that I don't have here. It's about, I thought only angels had such virtues. So he clearly was both impressive and also regarded as kind of virtuous, easy to get along with. And I'll say something more about one aspect of that in a little while. Okay, so became friends with Pope and Swift, and published essays in The Guardian for Addison Steele. These are all kind of standard things for a budding intellectual to want to do, and Berkeley's talent allowed him to do these things and made quite a lot of friends in high places, which really provided the basis for his later career in the Anglican Church. But then he didn't really want to go back to Ireland, so he got appointed first as a companion to one young nobleman and then to another, and he really spent really about 7 years kind of traveling around Europe, mostly in Italy. having, as far as we can tell, a really nice time. Although there is the harrowing description of how he was carried in a sedan chair over the Alps in the middle of winter. And then he's writing this letter, please don't do this. It was so horrifying and frantic. All I can think is, you're being carried by some other dudes. So, okay. Right. So, now we're going to move on and actually start getting slightly more serious, although hopefully never get too serious, but we'll see about that. So we're going to talk about an economic crisis that consumed Great Britain in the beginning of the 1720s. There was actually a very similar one in France just slightly earlier, and then the impact on Barclays. So this is the Great South Sea Bubble, which many of you will have heard of. And in many ways, this is an easier talk to give now than it would have been 10 years ago, because I really don't need to explain to you what a bubble is and how bad the consequences are, and because all you have to do is think of our recent bubble. The Great South Sea Bubble was the South Sea Company really took on a large proportion of the British national debt. So what happened is people, as it were, the way loans got made, they got made in many ways, including, bizarrely, lotteries. I had no idea. Lotteries funded a significant proportion of the national debt. People would loan money to the government in the form of annuities. And then what happened with it, but those were expensive for the government. Then what happened was the South Sea Company, people traded their annuities for stock in the South Sea Company, and then the government paid the South Sea Company a much smaller sum than they had been paying out in annuities. It's pension reform. Except people were excited about it because everybody was excited about the stock in the South Sea Company. The South Sea Company also got a monopoly on trade with South America, which turned out not to be particularly valuable because trade with South America was controlled by the Spanish. They allowed them one boat a year, and even that one really didn't usually happen. And the main thing they did was send slaves to South America and then bring back silver and gold, or that's what they wanted to do. So the whole thing is really kind of dicey. But it was a massive pump and dump scam. Really pretty explicitly, it's like all these things we think of as modern. The British, like they invented the stock market in the 1690s, and then by the 1720s they had the first bubble. So they were very precocious there. So South Sea stock went up by a factor of 10 in the first half of 1721, and then collapsed as it became clear that the finances of the company were unstable. I mean, the whole thing is just like amazing. There was a monopoly on banking from the Bank of England, which the South Sea Company evaded by taking over this other company called the Hollow Sword Blade Company, and it engaged illicitly in banking activities. They gave up making sword blades and turned to banking. And it's just anyway, it provoked Hogarth to make this thing. I won't go through it, but the people on the carousel, they get spun around, and depending on how long they go and when they get off, they either benefit or profit, because some people made a lot of money in the bubble. This is all familiar. Other people lost a lot of money in the bubble. Pope made a substantial fortune in the bubble. John Gay of the Beggar's Opera fame lost a substantial fortune in the bubble, so it was really kind of... and Berkeley himself actually ended up owning quite a lot of South Sea stock as a result of an even weirder thing where he was made the executor of Swift's mistress, whom he had never met, but ended up with a lot of South Sea stock as a result of that strange transaction. Anyway, so Berkeley returns from the continent just as the South Sea bubble collapses, right? And they were doing a very similar thing in France about 6 months to a year earlier in this the Mississippi scheme. And Berkeley actually was in France as that was unraveling. And so it made a big impact on him, as it did on many people, right? And so he wrote this pamphlet called An Essay Towards Preventing the Ruin of Great Britain. And this is how it begins. Whether the prosperity that preceded or the calamities that succeed. And the important thing I want to see is Berkeley's complaining about the run-up. It's not just the economic dislocation that follows. It's the attitudes that produce the bubble are as much an object of his concern as the bad consequences that follow afterwards. So, which of those have contributed most to our undoing is not so clear a point as it is that we are actually undone and lost to all sense of our true interest. Right? So they're undone not just in the sense of economically bad off, but have lost all sense of their true interest. Nothing less than this could render it pardonable to have recourse to these old-fashioned trite maxims concerning religion, industry, frugality, and public spirit, which are now forgotten, because you couldn't have a bubble if all those trite maxims were still in effect. But if revived and put in practice, may not only prevent our final ruin, but also render us a more happy and flourishing people than ever. Okay. And so these are themes that are just going to recur throughout, right? We used to be better, we have fallen, we need to regain our lost virtue. And if we can regain our lost virtue, then we're going to be able to go back and be better off like we used to be, right? That's going to be the consistent theme here, okay. And unfortunately, really, let's be honest, the essay toward preventing the ruin of Great Britain really does consist mostly of trite maxims. We have to encourage religion, we have to discourage luxury, we have to engage in public works projects. Some of this is slightly eccentric. We need to build a big Capitol building to inspire the public and employ the poor, to enrich the poor and promote public spirit. There's also a lot of really negative stuff about the British. Perjury and bribery are rampant. I actually think that was true, at that period of time. I love this. Other nations have been wicked, but we are the first to be wicked on principle. This is the intellectual asserting himself, right? It's not just the behavior, but the principles people have that are guiding that behavior that Berkeley is going to be concerned about. The crisis is urgent. The final period of the state approaches, which for those of you who don't read a lot of 18th century stuff means it's all over. It's done. But the prescriptions really are trite and obvious. Nowhere in the text does Berkeley explain exactly how this nation of perjurers and bribers is going to be induced to fork over the interest-free loans to the government that are part of his policy prescriptions. And so the whole thing really, Berkeley's biographer Luce likes to say, oh yes, there's much of value in the essay, but really, it's a rant that could have been written by any number of people. And all our interest in it here is not in the actual prescriptions, but in what it shows about how Berkeley was thinking about the situation, right? The depravity of morals, the idea that they used to be better, and that the only hope is somehow to restore ourselves to our proper virtues. Okay. Now, Berkeley, almost as soon as the essay appeared, which I've read actually now his entire surviving correspondence, which is mostly entirely uninformative, and much of it is tedious letters to his lawyers about unwinding the estate of Swift's mistress. But from that correspondence, one of the things we know is that before the essay had appeared in print, Berkeley had already realized it wasn't going to work. Because he quickly moved from thinking that we could just, as it were, assert these trite maxims, people would take them seriously, to a much more radical idea, which is that really what the thing to do is to abandon Europe and move to the New World and start over. And he proposed to do this in a particular way. He was going to found a college. And the proposed college was to educate the children of colonists and Native Americans, and they were going to become clergy in the Anglican Church. And so the core, he wrote a public proposal called the proposal. I'll show you the title page momentarily. The core of the public proposal is to engage in missionary activity and to promote the state religion. And he got a royal charter and a grant of £20,000, which at the time, that is an enormous amount of money. That's equivalent of, I don't know, maybe 100 million nowadays. It was a lot of money. Maybe not 100 million, maybe 10. But a lot of money. It was a big grant. Okay. And so this is the proposal. For the better supplying churches in our foreign plantations and for converting the savage Americans to Christianity, by a college to be erected in the Summer Islands, otherwise called the Isle of Bermuda. Bermuda? why Bermuda. He says truly that it's equally far from every part of the mainland, but as others pointed out, yeah, it's equally too far from every part of the mainland, 600 miles in fact, at a time when you had to do that in a sailing ship. It was poorly supplied with water and food. Berkeley's idea that somehow the descendant, he actually says this in a letter, that the other colonies are descended from whores and criminals, but Bermuda is different somehow. They weren't allowed there, and it's isolated from commerce, and so the corrupting influence of large sums of money won't be present. It's completely weird. He never went to Bermuda. He read some book. And the people that actually ran the serious British missionary operation, the Society for Propagation of the Gospel, they had people in America, and these people were outraged. I mean, they're just so outraged. Everything he said about America in the proposal is false. It's just a tissue of falsehoods from start to finish. But he, not only did he get a grant from the government, he raised as much, again, from private individuals. And so whatever you can say about the realism of this proposal, it resonated with his contemporaries. So although to us it looks bizarre, misguided, insane, it resonated from his contemporaries. Parliament voted, there were only 2 opposing votes in the Commons to give him this money. But the problem, the real problem, and the thing that's interesting for us here is, why is Berkeley doing this? The public proposal makes no sense. If Berkeley wants to find people to convert to the Anglican religion, he doesn't have to leave Ireland. Right he's a small minority in a large Catholic population at home. He could stay at home and work on this project just fine. Right? The missionary thing, and he didn't actually ever show any serious interest in missionary activity, and even when he eventually went to America, he didn't really show any serious interest in missionary activity, because it actually, bizarrely, for all his pushing of the Anglican religion, he was not a religious bigot. Unusually, he was not a religious bigot. In the end, he argued for Catholics to be able to vote and own land and go to college. And he conducted himself in America. There were very few Anglicans, and he hung out with these people that he was criticizing in his proposal. So I think, and most people think, the real story is actually expressed in a poem Berkeley wrote around the same time. It wasn't published at the time, but it was very widely distributed. He sent it to everybody. They sent it to other people. And the poem was called America, the Muses' Refuge. And I'm just going to point to some highlights here. First, the muse is disgusting. Right, that's at an age of climb, barren of every glorious theme. Right, so that's the negative side of the essay. Things are terrible. They're so terrible. They discuss the muse, and then if we can move to this new place, we shall get another golden age. Notice we're not going to get our first one. We're going to get another one. Right? The rise of empire and of arts, the good and great inspiring epic rage. Berkeley's poetry is not so wonderful. And then here's the stirring conclusion. Not such as Europe breeds in her decay. These poets in their epic rage are going to be better than the ones that Europe has. Such as she bred when fresh and young. And so then, westward the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts already passed. The 5th shall close the drama today. Time's noblest offspring is the last. Now, it turns out that this kind of, there's been a lot of, believe it or not, controversy about how to read this last stanza. Where there are people that see in it a reference to the Christian apocalypse. And in one bizarre essay, Harry Bracken argues that Berkeley thought that Native Americans were actually descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and he wanted to convert these Jews in order to hasten the second coming. The only thing I can say about that is there is no evidence in support of this view other than some vague affinities with the Apocalypse of St. John. It turns out, though, that this idea that Christianity spread in stages, moving on as it got too corrupt in one place, starting in Italy and moving steadily westward, was a common trope at that time. And so Berkeley is really kind of just harnessing an idea that was already circulating, that the progress of the Christian empire, this isn't the British Empire, is ever westward. And then since you can't get west of America, that's the last act. So Berkeley, I think, was not motivated primarily by the missionary impulse. And there's no reason that he didn't genuinely believe and want to do those things, but that isn't why he devoted a decade of his life to this chaotic project. It's the reestablishment of Christian civilization that's the goal here, and I just want to keep insisting it's the reestablishment of Christian civilization. The virtuous social order that once characterized the old world is damaged beyond redemption, and the only solution is to start over in the new. The empire is not the British Empire, but the Christian Empire. I actually do think that's important. It's not that Berkeley wasn't a loyal subject of the British Crown, but he had bigger fish to fry than the political fortunes of Great Britain. Okay. It failed. So the Bermuda Project, actually, it turned out to be the Newport Project, because Berkeley was having trouble getting the cash, decided to try to force the issue by coming to America himself. He had the good sense to avoid Bermuda. He landed first in Virginia and then ended up in Newport, which for us might now sound strange, but Newport was one of the kind of mercantile capitals of the colonies at the time. This was a prosperous and promising place to end up. After 3 years, he learned that the grant would never be paid. He got somebody to ask Walpole, the Prime Minister. Walpole said, "If you ask me as His Majesty's Minister, I assure you that money will be paid as soon as suits the public convenience. If you ask me as a friend of the good Dean whether he should remain in America awaiting these funds, I would urge him to return at once." Interestingly, Walpole actually made a substantial contribution of his own money to the project, but it wasn't worth the political heat. Berkeley aroused some opposition among the planters in the Caribbean, because among other things, he said he actually wanted to convert these African slaves. And also founding a college in America, it made other people anxious who were concerned about not reducing the dependency of the colonies on the mothership, right? So training Anglican priests in America was something that some people came to think was mistaken colonial policy. A lot of people in America thought he was going to be the first bishop in the colonies. That was false, because they actually hung on to this. The Anglican Church believes in the apostolic succession, so to create a bishop, you have to send somebody back to England to be consecrated by a current bishop. And they really did not send a bishop to America for a long time because they wanted the control that forcing people to come back allowed them. Daniel gave his talk about the continuing importance and influence of Kant. Berkeley is not important in that way. Right? The college failed. He had some vague influence on philosophy in the colonies. Jonathan Edwards, vaguely a materialist. Samuel Johnson, who was a faculty member at Yale, became the first president of King's College, New York, which is the origin of Columbia. Was a thoroughgoing Berkeleyan, and he wrote the first philosophy textbook published in America. So there was some of this going on, but it faded, right? It really had no lasting influence. And there was no attempt to rebuild Christian civilization. He just hung out in Newport for a few years, bought a farm, came with some slaves, gave the farm to Yale with the slaves. Some people got excited about this a few years ago. Berkeley's attitude towards these are complicated and interesting, because as soon as he got back, he preached a powerful sermon about the stupidity of racism, but he didn't free his slaves, so go figure. Okay. I just can't help myself. This is the Bermuda group. This is a painting of George over there on the right, his wife Anne seating, holding his son Henry. And then the painter is there in the background, John Smyver. He was the first professional portrait artist in America, brought by Berkeley Berkeley, after his return to England, actually donated the first pipe organ in the colonies. So yeah, this is the kind of influence Berkeley had. That's his house. That's me at his house. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Berkeley's economic writings. Except I'm going to have to leave out really the most interesting bit because it doesn't, it would be too involved to go into it and connect it to the main theme of my talk. So Berkeley returned to England from the New World. Oh, he got married just before he left. He got married like a week before he got on a boat for this 6-week voyage across the ocean. And there's no mention of the woman in his correspondence or anywhere else. So anyway, this has made historians happy because there was something to sort out. Who was this woman Berkeley married? Did he actually know her? So he returned and he hung out in London for a while because he needed to get a gig. And he worked his connections, and actually another large part of his correspondence is him writing to his patrons saying, hey, can you put in a good word for me? And then say, well, you know, George, I just put in a good word for my son, and my credit's kind of used up, so not this time. It's a lot like Chicago. It's kind of funny. Some of this, early on, he did this just before going to America. He became Dean of Derry, which was a no-show job. So he got quite a lot of money. He was in Derry once. Most of the time he was Dean of Derry, he was in Rhode Island. But he got the money every year, which was important to him. So he became Bishop of Cloyne. And Cloyne was an obscure bishopric in the far south of Ireland. It's more obscure now than it was then, but there weren't actually that many Anglicans in Cloyne. So it's also a very Catholic area of Ireland. But shortly after he came back, he actually wrote a lot of stuff while he was in London, and shortly after returning to Ireland to go to Cloyne, and I'm not going to mention most of this here, but I want to talk for a few minutes about The Querist, which is Berkeley's main book on economic issues. The title is because the book consists entirely of questions. There are no declarative statements, not even a preface. They're leading questions, as you might guess. It's not really hard to figure out what he means, what he wants you to think, in spite of the fact. This seems really odd to us. As far as I can tell, some of his contemporaries responded to The Querist, but nobody seemed put off by the format. So I just think they were a little freer in their forms of literary expression at this particular moment in history. Swift wrote a lot of poetry that had political effect, and Swift's own contributions to economics came in the form of letters purported to be from a draper. And so I just think we don't want to get hung up on the format of the book. I don't think it was I think Berkeley did it that way because he had a bunch of punchy thoughts, but not really a theory, an overarching theory, and so the question format, allowed him to express his ideas without the commitment to having long discursive explanations, right? And so it's focused on public policy issues. The text consists of several hundred number of questions. In the first edition, there are actually 800 some odd number of questions. They're very short. In fact, here's the first two, and I'm going to talk about these, and they're pretty typical in their length. And then in later editions, he shorted it because part of what he was proposing was a central bank for Ireland, and he realized that was going nowhere, and it was all kind of technical and boring, and so he took out a lot of the queries having to do with the central bank. He also proposed a paper currency. These are the things historians of economics now talk about Berkeley in virtue of. I'm going to ignore that, although apparently he was one of the first to clearly understand how a central bank should work and a paper currency. And by paper currency, he really literally meant a fiat currency like we have now. And that really was quite radical for his time. There were lots of paper circulating, but the paper all represented claims on physical goods of various kinds. While Berkeley's paper was like our paper, it was to be supported nothing but by nothing but faith in the government. And he had ideas about how that would work. But the centerpiece of the book is a diagnosis of why Ireland is so poor and what to be done about it. And query number one, whether there ever was, is, or will be an industrious nation poor or an idle rich. And then query number two is whether a people can be called poor where the common sort are well-fed, clothed, and lodged. And the central theme of the querist really just is that the common sort, the poor, they need to be industrious, and their industry needs to be appropriately rewarded. Right? And he thought if that happened, everything else would follow. And then much of what the querist is about, the point of the central bank and the paper currency, is the current system for... So Ireland actually had an incredible shortage of small change. And so it was actually very hard to conduct small cash transactions in Ireland at this time. And Berkeley thought this was a problem. It was discouraging the industry of the poor because it was hard for them to get paid. And so a lot of the book is about removing obstacles that stand in the way of the poor being appropriately industrious. And so, right, and that's what I want to just talk about just a little bit, because some of what he says here is interesting, and then it also is related to my themes. I'm sort of okay. Berkeley thought the poor worked too little. He was not alone in this. You know, you go trolling through literature by English-speaking Irishmen at this time, and complaints about the laziness of the Irish are not exactly hard to find. Although maybe that's nothing specifically due to Ireland, because I think you could go trolling through the literature created by the prosperous in this country right now, and complaints about the laziness of the poor might not be hard to find either. But Berkeley thought about this actually a little differently, is they work too little. And he thought this was bad for them. This is not the interesting or original bit. And because they work too little, they make each other worse off and all of us worse off, because they're a burden, not a benefit to the prosperity of the whole. Right? What's a little bit interesting about Berkeley is he thought one of the reasons, not the only reason, that the poor work too little, but one of the important reasons why the poor work too little is because they don't want enough. Right? That the poor in Ireland, and he actually had a moderately sympathetic diagnosis of how they got in this condition, although he sometimes puts it in ways, as we will see now, are maybe not entirely happy. They're content with subsistence. And so, as he puts it in Query 19, whether the bulk of our Irish natives are not kept from thriving by that cynical content in dirt and beggary which they possess to a degree beyond any other in Christendom. So the right way to read that is, what he means by that is they're content with just enough to get by. Right? And what that means is, for example, you're not going to get more work out of them by paying them more. In fact, you'll get less work out of them by paying them more. And he's quite explicit about that, because that if you pay them more, then they just have to work less to get enough to get by. And so Berkeley, in modern terms, he thought that the supply of labor was inversely related to the cost of labor. So the supply curve had the wrong slope. Right. So the wants of the poor must be encouraged for the good of all. And he says over and over again, his examples are very stereotyped. They should eat beef and wear shoes. And the idea is that beef and shoes are things that are not available in the subsistence economy. Right? In the subsistence economy, you get potatoes and rags for your feet. But if you actually want shoes and if you want beef, then you got to do enough work that you get more than just enough, so that you can then afford these luxuries. And so Berkeley really, and he talks about ways you might try and get the poor to want these things, and actually he himself put some of these ideas in practice, as we'll see in a minute. And if you can get them to have these consumption desires, then they would have to work harder to fulfill their wants, and we would all be better off. So that's part of the prescription, and there's quite a lot of the queerist is, about how to get the poor to want more stuff. Okay. Now the flip side of that is Berkeley he's never stupid. He's often insensitive. He's sometimes bigoted, although not necessarily in the ways you would predict. But he's never stupid. And he does realize that even if the poor want to work more, there are also problems in Ireland. There isn't enough work. Right. So he doesn't think that just creating more work would solve the problem, because until the poor want more, they won't work more. But getting them to want more isn't enough either, because there wouldn't be enough work for them even if they did want more. And so they got to take on both of these. And the reason there isn't enough work, and here I think Berkeley is both much more clearly in agreement with most other of his contemporaries, but also more radical than most of them as well. Ireland had a big problem. Much of the land in Ireland was owned by people who lived in England. England also essentially forbade the Irish to do anything economically that might make anybody in England even a little bit worse off. So essentially the only trade, the only exports the Irish were allowed is they could send unprocessed wool to England. They couldn't send it to France, they couldn't make clothes out of it, they couldn't even make cloth out of it. All they could do was send wool to England. That was all the English allowed them to do. Because if they made clothes, then they would be competing with British cloth manufacturing. If they could export to France, they'd be competing with the Brits. And so, sorry, British, the English. I need to be more precise when I say these things, right? Competing with the English. And so one of the things everybody complains about is this horrible British policy towards Ireland. Berkeley has no patience with those complaints. And the reason he has no patience is they're twofold, which is the English are not going to change, and we don't want to be, he wouldn't have put it this way for obvious reasons, we don't want to be one of those oil exporting third world countries, right? We want to move up the food chain and make our own manufacturers, and so even if the British were to allow us to send our wool to France, that wouldn't do us the kind of good we need. Right, so he's not a fan of the pastoralist economy, which at this point in time occupied a large amount of the Irish land. And then the potatoes were grown on small plots for subsistence. So what we need to do is, the rich, many of whom are in England, and that's a problem in itself, because then we're just exporting the profits of Irish production to England. But even the ones who stay in Ireland, all they want to do is drink French wine and get fancy Norwegian fur. This is actually a little ironic in our current era, rather than local Irish oak. So he goes on at great length about this luxury trade in fur paneling and why these people can't content themselves with the simple modesty of oak. But the point is, the poor want too little, the rich both want too much, and they want the wrong things. Rather than French wine, they should drink locally produced beer and cider. Berkeley's no ascetic, right? He doesn't want people to live Spartan lives, but he thinks that they could live good lives, as good a life as you should want to live, consuming only local products. And so the rich must be compelled to consume locally. Berkeley knew this proposal, not that, but Berkeley felt this so strongly that he actually suggests a couple places in the Quercus that Ireland would be better off if it had no foreign trade at all. He actually gives these vivid metaphors. Even if you built a wall 5 miles high around the whole country, that would be better than our current situation. So he really thinks that this exporting of the profits derived from the wool trade, that was really the only profitable trade, is impoverishing Ireland, that Ireland actually derives a net detriment from its foreign trade. And that fixing that, he doesn't think every country derives a net detriment from its foreign trade, right? He thinks that's specific to Ireland, and fixing that would be. So, the querist is on policies that will promote work. Work is an important source of virtue for Berkeley. It's really central to his thinking about how people should live their lives. The idleness is not something he's ever happy about. And although he proposes a number of innovative policies, the point is to remove obstacles to the natural desire to work. Right? So it's not that people don't want to work and we have to find ways to make them work. Rather, people do want to work, but we have put them in a situation in which their natural inclination to work is thwarted. Right? Now, he's not, also it's important to see he's not egalitarian. What form of labor you engage in and what goods you should be consuming depends a lot on your situation in life. Right? So, he set up a spinning school for the children of poor families in his diocese, and he actually paid them in cash. And then in a letter he says, I'm really excited about this. Actually, first says, it was really hard to get them to show up. He goes, but now it's really going well. We pay them hard money, and they keep it to buy clothes for themselves rather than giving it to their parents. And he's so excited about this. They become proper little consumers doing their bit for the Irish economy. Right? And then he employed sturdy vagrants to grow flax to make Irish linen, so that rather than imported clothes, the affluent could wear locally produced linen. Although his wife seems to have been in charge of that project. Okay. And then his own children, though, had music and dancing lessons and learned Latin from their dad. They didn't go to the spinning school. So, but they did actually, idleness was not tolerated even for Berkeley's own children. It's just the specific form of industry they engaged in. Okay. Now we're going to get back to the philosophy. Although even here, it's going to be a little disappointing. There's going to be a lot about the prefaces to these books. Okay. So, I'll just skip that. I'll just read this quote. If the principles, this is from the preface to the three dialogues, if the principles which I here endeavor to propagate are admitted for true, the consequences which I think will evidently flow from thence are that atheism and skepticism will be utterly destroyed, many intricate points made plain, great difficulties solved, several useless parts of science retrenched, speculation referred to practice, and men reduced from paradoxes to common sense. And metaphysics is practical too for Berkeley. That's really what I want you to get out of that. Whether he's right is another issue, but it's not just about getting at the truth. It's that getting at this truth will have consequences for practical life. And he's consistent on that throughout. Berkeley thought that the new approach to philosophy, pioneered by Descartes, I'm just picking him as an emblem, was very dangerous. And this is really in his notebooks right from the beginning. Unfortunately, he also thought it was probably true. So he was in a slightly dicey situation. And it was dangerous because it led to skepticism, opened the doors to atheism, and also led people to doubt those things which other men know and believe things which other men laugh at, is another thing he says about this. It really, it's bad for religion, and it contributes to the moral decay of society, which Berkeley is concerned about in all of his writing. And he traced its cause to bad philosophy. Now, as it turns out, it's not the fundamental principles, but the way in which they were interpreted and applied that's the problem, according to Berkeley. And we'll see that. So part of his project is to provide better foundations for religion. As those of you who read Berkeley know, he's endlessly proving the existence of God. He even thought the theory of vision provided an excellent proof of the existence of God. But I don't want to worry about that right now, because immaterialism does not just restore our knowledge of God. And that restoring our knowledge of God was important to Berkeley. I don't want to deny that, but that's not what I want to focus on here. It also restores what I want to call our epistemic innocence. And I mean something actually pretty specific by that, which is that Berkeley thought that the illiterate bulk of mankind, the uneducated, they walk the high road of plain common sense for the most part, easy and undisturbed. And what he means by that is they look at a glass of water, and they know that there's a glass of water there. That all they have to do to know that there's a cup before them is to look at it. Right? So the senses operate in us to give us, unreflectively, knowledge of the world around us, and moreover, not just any kind of knowledge of the world around us, but the kind of knowledge that allows us to guide our action in sensible ways. Right? So I need to know that the cup's to the right. I can look and I can see where the cup is, then I can grab it and I can bring it to my lips. Descartes lost this ability. Right? And honestly, how many, we've all taught the meditations, right? Those skeptical arguments at the beginning, they're completely brilliant. Right? How many of you have ever convinced a student that his responses to those arguments are as brilliant as the original skeptical arguments? Right? So Berkeley reads Descartes and he reads Locke and he thinks they are onto something. Their description of our minds and in a certain sense of the world and the relation between us and the world is correct, but the way they're interpreting all that leads to skepticism, and although they all think they have a response to skepticism, none of their responses are effective at all. Right? So Descartes brilliantly recast how to think about our access to the world, but then when he tries to rebuild our knowledge, Berkeley thought that was a complete and total failure. Right? And so that the result is that people don't know what they want. The ordinary folks, though, and I really think this is important, I think he means this completely literally. It is the high road of common sense. Right? And they are right to be easy and undisturbed. Right? This is not their ignorance leading them wrongly to be easy and undisturbed. Easy and undisturbed is the way they should be. This is their proper condition. But philosophers have destroyed the easy and undisturbed path to knowledge for the educated. As Berkeley puts it, first we have raised the dust, and then we complain we cannot see. Okay. But a more rigorous application of the new philosophical principles leads to immaterialism, which is the denial that there is any material stuff in the world. So for Berkeley, everything there is in the world is minds and the ideas in those minds. Right? There's a lot more to it than that, but that's enough for now. Right? Notice that this is usually regarded as so radical as to be somewhat crazy, and many people, in fact, one of Berkeley's early letters, he writes, "What do people think of my book?" And his friend Percival writes back, "Well, this guy I know is a doctor, heard about your book, and he thinks you must be insane and should take remedies." So Berkeley's proposal here seems not commonsensical, right? Seems radical beyond belief, that there are no material things, seems utterly radical. But for Berkeley, the same principles that first lead to skepticism, pursued to a certain point, that means to the absurd conclusion that there is no material stuff in the world, lead men back to common sense. Right? So now, there's a little bit of a problem with this, because he might mean two things by this. It could be a reductio. Right? That if we look at these philosophical principles seriously, take them to the end, we see that they're incoherent, and thus we can reject them and be commonsensical again. In the paper, which fortunately not everyone here has seen, I attribute a view sort of like this to Wittgenstein, but I here retract that attribution, and I'm going to be a proper historian and make it Bale. Instead, both because I really don't think it was Wittgenstein, it's the right interpretation of Wittgenstein, and I do think it really is Bale. Right? That Bale wants to destroy our faith in reason by showing how it leads to incoherencies. For Bale, the point of this is then we can be true Christians by just believing by faith alone. He was a fideist. And so that might be what Berkeley's up to. And there have been interpreters that have come very close to attributing that kind of view to him. But I don't think that's right. Right? Instead, I think Berkeley thinks he's solved the skeptical problem. Right? on its own terms. But he solved it in a way, and here's the part, and this is unfortunately, actually or fortunately, because I don't have much more to say, where I need more argument. But he solved it in a way where it turns out the illiterate bulk of mankind and those sophisticated people who have recognized the truth of immaterialism, we're all now in the same place again. The educated got to go a little bit roundabout, but we end up in exactly the same place. And so one of the things I want to say is Berkeley also famously said, you know, speak with the vulgar, think with the learned. And a lot of times this is taken as an advocation of hypocrisy. But I think for Berkeley, what that means is what the vulgar say is, in its own terms, taken literally, true. Right? What the vulgar say is the truth. Right? But once you start down the path of philosophy, you have to go all the way in order to not get stuck at one of these halfway points where you start doubting the vulgar, to get back in the end to realizing that you can just look and know, and touch and know, and hear and know. That the senses give us immediate and unreflective knowledge, and that's the end. So materialism necessary to restore the sophisticated to the epistemic innocence of the ignorant. But immaterialism, this is the important thing, is also true. Right? And in some ways, I think this is the message that has not been taken seriously enough by the community of Berkeley scholars. That they offer interpretations of Berkeley in which it doesn't turn out that the ignorant are entitled to their undisturbed confidence. And I think that can't be right for Berkeley. It really is a restorative project. Right? We were okay, and then we lost our innocence, and now we're going to get it back. Right? Okay. So, I think Berkeley shows a consistent pattern in all his projects, and I think we need to read this consistent pattern into the M&E stuff, the brilliant early works. Something's gone wrong with the social world. I think that would be a better word than political, by the way, because it's virtue and morals as much as politics that Berkeley is on about. Something's gone wrong with the social world. A radical change is required to put things back the way they should be. And his rhetoric is pretty consistent here. It's always a putting things back. Right? They were good, then they've fallen, and now we need to put them back. But this is what makes Berkeley interesting. So far, it's boring. What makes Berkeley interesting is it always turns out that the way to bring back the good old days is to do something really dramatic and radical, right? Abolish gold and silver and issue a paper currency. Move to America. Get rid of the material world, right? Build a 5-mile-high wall around Ireland, right? All of these things, these radical proposals, are in the service for this fundamentally conservative vision. We need to return ourselves to a better world, but the only way to do that is to do something really dramatic and radical. And I think I'll just stop right there and leave you with a picture of the good mission. Questions? Berkeley.
So, as you said, Berkeley thought that the common people, the vulgar, had this knowledge that the philosophers lost track of. But he also thought that the Irish common people, the Irish vulgar, were very wrong about what they wanted or how they conducted their lives. So what is the connection between perceptive knowledge that they have access to and this ethical or practical knowledge that they seem to have no access to according to Berkeley?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I think although I think there's, I'm not sure I could prove this. So this is what I'm going to say is partly speculative. But I think if we look at what Berkeley says, and unfortunately there isn't that much of it, about how it is that the native Irish are so content in their beggary. That I think part of the story is going to be is they've been put in a situation where trying to get anything more is going to be punished, not rewarded. So it's not that they're ignorant of what they want, but rather they've been trained, right? So the Irish, the lazy Irish are lazy not because it's their nature to be lazy or because they're confused, but rather because of their situation, they've been trained to not want any more than that. So it really is there. Ireland in its current situation on the kind of, for the economics, has departed from the former innocence. So one way to think about this is there are strains in Berkeley where he almost sounds like one of these agrarian, like a Thomas Jefferson type, right? And I think sometimes he writes as if that's the way it used to be in Ireland, right? Every prosperous peasant on their own plot of land, and then now we've kind of devoted all the land to raising sheep to send wool to England, and as a result of that, the native Irish have been put in a situation in which, why should they want more? Because they couldn't get it, and you keep that up for a while, and you train people to be that way. So that's why I think, and so they're in a sense, in that part of their lives, they are like the Cartesians. They've been perverted already by their situation in the world. So I think that's the answer to that apparent paradox, is that in their wants, they've already been corrupted. Right? And so then the idea is we now need to get them back to some more natural state of virtue.
I mean, maybe I misunderstood the question, but I thought that, or maybe I misunderstood what you said, but I thought the contrast was that while in their wants, their practical lives,
right,
and therefore the social and economic life of the country,
right,
something's gone drastically wrong.
Right.
These are the illiterate who live in epistemic innocence.
That's right, right. So in their right.
So I mean, those two things don't seem to match.
So because their epistemic innocence, right? So maybe this is the problem. Let me try this, and I'll see if this is the problem. By that I mean just their perceptual. That's just their right. So in their ability to look and see, right? So the native Irish, they are completely unimpaired in, if they need to get a little bit of potatoes, they know how to dig, they know how to plant, because they can just look and know. Right. And then I thought Berkeley's question is, why can't they know what's good for them in this other sense, in what they kind of their social desires, what they should want, not just what they know about the world, but what they should want to accomplish in the world. And so what I wanted to say is, although they're uncorrupted in this epistemic sense, they have been corrupted in this conative sense. What they want isn't the right thing anymore.
Right. I guess my worry was
So
really,
misunderstand something?
well, I think that doesn't matter whether it's the same question. But I was worried about the idea that it's the same problem because it applies to different people, right? The people who've lost their epistemic innocence and haven't gone far enough to regain it, which is an interesting idea, are the relatively wealthy and relatively sophisticated, just not quite sophisticated enough.
Right.
But the people sunk in rural idiocy,
right,
is a completely different group of people. So,
right.
So I mean, those problems.
Right. So
although there's a structural similarity.
Right. So
maybe that's all you want.
That's all I want. Right. Thanks, Peter. That's really helpful. I'm asserting a structural similarity, not that there's really just one problem. Except in the sense that all these many causes all have the same kind. I guess it's structural. When I say same kind of effect, then I'm just going back to the structure. So I'll just stop there before I dig any deeper. Sally?
I was just sitting here thinking, like, can I come up with an example of a philosopher who says, well, here's my theory, and it really doesn't conform to common sense at all. I mean, instead it's, Kant saying about the categorical imperative, which nobody understands, and all these different formulas and zillions of books have been written about what it really means. Well, it's just the philosopher's formulation of a common sense principle that we all are conscious of. That's one example. Or Heidegger's beginning the being of time, the common old question of being has been forgotten, I'm going to remind, when you get us back on track. That is, can you think of a philosopher who doesn't? I guess the question is, what's...
You don't want to ask the question that way, because I can, but that's not relevant.
Russell.
Well,
yeah, Russell, I mean, the positivists were always ragging on common sense.
Oh, that's true. But it is a very common sort of claim. And,
right.
And I guess I want to hear what you think, like why that's the case. Maybe it's obvious, and why it's the case in Barclays' particular case.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's...
So why sort of generally, do we hear this over and over again?
Well...
By people who are putting forward these really bizarre theories.
Right, so that's actually, I think your question is actually a really interesting one, and I'm not sure I know how to answer it, because I'm not sure I could give the same answer for everyone, and then the question is, why does the behavior persist even though the justification of the behavior is always changing, right? So if you look at, say, for example, why contemporary analytic philosophers wrap themselves in the mantle of common sense is because they still think of them in some attenuated sense as doing some kind of analytic task, right? And so if you get too far from the folk, then you can no longer plausibly pretend that you're analyzing the concepts that we all share, et cetera, right? I don't think that's in Berkeley or anybody in the 18th century, that conception of why common sense is good. I think Berkeley thinks that the common sense is good because he really is interested in unreflective knowledge, and he thinks that's a great good, and that's what the illiterate bulk of mankind have, right? But these are two.
That seems incompatible. I mean, if you think that's so great, then why go to the extreme measures to try to convince us of the truth of his extreme sounding philosophy?
Okay, but here I do think actually something I always think of, probably falsely. Peter, you're making me so anxious. I cannot use the name Wittgenstein in your presence. Is something that I think I've learned not necessarily directly from Wittgenstein, but from people who describe themselves as Wittgensteinians, is that the folk are also philosophically innocent, not ignorant, innocent, right? So that they just don't take a stand on these questions. And Berkeley thinks these are real questions that you can take a stand on. And so it's not that the illiterate bulk of mankind have the whole of the truth. It's just as far as they go, they are absolutely right. Right? But there's more to be said. And then what happened is people started saying it and they mucked it up. And they started saying things that were incompatible with the starting point. And Berkeley, that's what Berkeley wants to resist, is the idea that the folk, although not in possession of the whole truth, what they are in possession of is true. And that's why you have to go through. And the other thing is, radical is, this is one of these interesting phrases. I think most of the people who put forward these radical proposals do not think of them as radical. They just seem to plain obvious consequences of widely shared presuppositions. And that's certainly the way Berkeley not just writes, but we have his notebooks. We know that's the way he thought too, right? It just seemed obvious to him that the presupposition of matter was both the source of all these difficulties and straightforwardly stupid. But the important point is, right, is that the illiterate, they don't have the whole story, right? They don't take a stand on these issues. Now, where it's not Wittgenstein and Berkeley is the thinking you should take a stand on these issues. And in that sense, he really was a philosopher, right? That's the sense in which he was a philosopher of, solidly in the early modern tradition, is he thought these were real questions and you should take a stand on them. Where I think he was a little bit different, though, was I think he really believed that the ignorant were correct as far as what they believed went. It's just that that didn't go beyond these kind of straightforward practical truths. And I'll just say one last thing is, he also thought doing the philosophical bit actually had some benefits because that allowed you to get the advantages of the mechanical philosophy. So he was interested in Newtonian science, but he thought that you had to think about it the right way, and the immaterialism allowed you to get the access to the tools of the mechanical philosophy without commitment to those parts of it that led to atheism and skepticism. Right. So that stuff about useless areas of science retrenched, that's not about getting rid of science altogether. That's about beating science back into its proper place so that we can use it successfully. But once we beat it back in its proper place, it turns out that the ordinary folks have always been right. There's no conflict once it's been appropriately. Yeah. I think Aiden was waiting.
Yeah, so I sort of on the same lines. I have quite sort of two related questions about what the folk think and what the philosophers think and how they're related. And you sort of said like the folk are right as far as they go.
Right.
How far do they go? I mean, I thought there was supposed to be some. I thought that there was supposed to be some kind of, in principle, tension at some point between what the folk say and the immaterialism. It looks like they're in tension, but then it turns out they could both be true. I thought that was some. Was I wrong in thinking that was at the end there was some thought that like it looks like these are incompatible, but I want as other commentators have thought that, but I want to say no, that's both straightforwardly true.
Right.
So I'm not saying what. So I'm trying to understand what even superficially seems like in tension between what the folk say and think and any doctrine of materialism or immaterialism, right? What are we imagining the folk saying? I mean, I thought there were things like, I see a cup there.
Right.
And I know it's there because of the cup. I mean, they're not saying things like,
I know
I see material things, but
right.
the folk
right.
don't say those things.
Right.
So, what is the theses or even...
So what Berkeley thought is that if you took seriously, and he's a little vague because I think he thinks of all these people as relevantly similar, but if you took seriously Descartes or Locke, right, that their philosophical principles lead to skeptical conclusions, and you're no longer, if you actually accept Descartes' epistemic and metaphysical views, you're no longer in a position to know there's a cup there just by looking, right? And that's what's in tension with the folk.
Nothing in immaterialism.
No.
I thought there was some part at the end where there's some question of interpreting Berkeley as there's a challenge of bringing his philosophy together with the thought that things were right all along.
Okay, so there's two issues here, first is, did Berkeley think that he ever said anything incompatible with what the folk thought? I think the answer to that one is pretty straightforwardly no. He thought that everything he said was perfectly compatible with what the folk thought. I don't think there's a real issue about that, and there's a handful of texts that I think you could strain and read in some different way, but I really, we could talk about specific examples, but that's not the hard question. The hard question is, did he say things that were incompatible with the folk thought? Contrary to what he believed, right, is his view, is immaterialism actually compatible even with his conception of what the folk believe? And that's where I would like to make it work so that it's actually compatible, not merely thought by Berkeley to be compatible. But that there is more difficulty in making that work out.
But how is there even? I didn't see if folk are saying things like I see a cup, and he's saying things like everything's immaterial, everything's mental.
Right.
What's the prima facie tension between those two things?
Well, now we have to figure out what a cup is if you're an immaterialist. This is one of the problems.
But the folk don't have any.
No, the folk don't have any problems, but it may turn out that the things Berkeley has available to him to search. So now I'm Berkeley and I'm an immaterialist. And I say there's a cup before my eyes. What is that cup, right? And can I say anything about what the cup is that's compatible with the kinds of things folks say about the cup? Like that I can have the same cup back, and you and I can both hold the same cup. It's not obvious that on immaterialism that you could walk over and pick up that cup and it would be the same cup that I picked up. And now there's a question about whether the folk really are committed to these claims about identity, and Berkeley actually works that. But that's the kind of place where issues come up. Is that helpful? John?
So I just wanted to make sure I understood one point. So, okay, the ordinary people, they're correct as far as they go, and that's consistent with immaterialism. But you also take Berkeley to be claiming that, not just that, but that there's really no need for them to ever pursue philosophy. Just leave them in their state. Is that what you want?
Yeah. But just this one little qualification. I think that's right, but there is some reason for people who don't care about philosophy, just are interested in practical matters, to be educated in this way, because there are these, there is Newtonian science.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say, it seems like there's some advantages to doing the philosophy.
There are some advantages, right.
But it seems like there are other advantages as well. I mean, if somebody doesn't go through that, sort of philosophical training, it seems like even though you could end up in a place that's consistent with common sense, there's some big advantages to the philosophical position, because you're more stable. Or you could say the person who's in common sense, and they're always going to be vulnerable to falling into these errors, which then lead to skepticism and atheism, right? So why wouldn't it be important to be more concerned with that path if he's so concerned with avoiding those things?
So I think that's a question that seems much more pressing here in the 21st century than it did in the 18th century, when we're trying to get nearly half of the college-age kids in the country to go to college and expose them, and we try to make everybody literate. Then the exposure to the kind of material that can destabilize your unreflected faith in your senses is really just something that's going to happen to a very large proportion of people. If instead you're sitting there in 18th century Ireland, where something like 5 to 10% of the population is literate, Berkeley's aiming his book at them. He's not writing for philosophers, right? He's writing for the general educated population. It's just that's a very small proportion of all the people. So it may be that nowadays, when there is no illiterate of mankind, at least in this country, we would want to teach everybody in materialism, right? But nevertheless, for philosophical purposes, I think it's really salutary to keep in mind is the reason we need to do that is to allow them to defend themselves against bad ideas, not because you need it in order to acquire the knowledge necessary for the practical affairs of life. So I take that's the real point, is that you don't need this philosophy in order to be in a position to acquire knowledge from our senses, the kind of knowledge that's necessary.
Atheism is an error? I've heard that come up a couple times here.
That atheism is error. Well, most is a tricky word, right? Do you mean now or ever, or?
I don't know, maybe a minute about the role of
atheism
in...
So now, almost nobody believes that atheism is an error, I would say. Well, I know that's too strong, actually. That's too strong. But a very large number of philosophers do not think atheism is an error at this particular moment. Okay. Right? In the 18th century, the number of philosophers who did not think atheism is... But if you actually read it, he's probably not a Christian, even though the name of the book is Christianity, Not Mysterious. But he's very clearly not an atheist. And so in Berkeley's world, he's not, the people he's disputing with on the religious issues are not, for the most part, people who are explicit out atheists. Rather, they're people that abandon Christian dogma. And again, Berkeley was no religious bigot. By that, he didn't mean, the 39 principles. He was happy to count you as a Christian as long as you kind of had some basic, there was God's Son and the resurrection as long as you hung on to some stuff like that, Catholics were Christians according to Berkeley. Which, again, you can't, it's hard for us now to kind of think ourselves back into a time in which, right, it seemed perfectly sensible to exclude Catholics from the ability to own property, right? But yeah, but in Berkeley's time, atheism, out and explicit atheism was really not an option defended by everybody. Not even Hume, actually, in his published works, defended atheism. The dialogues were published posthumously, and even they, whether they're atheist, is a really kind of tricky and interesting question. So yeah, so now I'm losing track. I'm gonna go with Sonia.
So, at one point you said that Berkeley blamed poor people because, according to him, they didn't want enough, they didn't want so little.
Yeah, blame is a tricky word, but yeah. Although sometimes, as he put it, their cynical contempt or beggary, it does sound like blame.
So, it seems that, as far as I understand at least, the source of the economical problem that occurred at the time is this greediness of the people. And in fact, when he tried to establish a school in Bermuda, he was trying to, trying to save these people from this corrupting effects of this greediness, of having more wealth and so on and so forth. So that seems to be, maybe a tension there, that on the one hand, if you want too little, you become lazy and poor, and on the other hand, if you want too much, you get corrupted, and the whole system collapses.
So think of him as an Aristotelian.
Okay, so
You want the right amount. That actually is the solution, with one complication is what and how much you should want depends on who you are. Right, so there isn't the right wants for everybody. Right, some people should want oak paneling, and other people should be content with sod huts. But they should have roofs, and they should have shoes and beef. Right. But no, he like I said, Berkeley really does actually. I mean, he really kind of the beef and shoes thing. I tried to count. I think there are 5 queries devoted to beef and shoes. And there's about the same about French wine, maybe more about French wine. He found that really offensive. Sometimes he kind of slips a little and says, well, why wouldn't they at least drink the much cheaper and at least as good Italian wine? Which I think is probably not the right thing for him to say in context. But yeah, no, it's very much a matter of we're supposed to want the right amount, and the right amount is neither nothing or a subsistence living, but nor is it luxuries. And mostly in a lot of his discussion, what he thinks is the reason it's the reason people want these things is the wrong reason. The reason people want French wine is not. He seems a little bit less. He would be less troubled if they wanted it because of its intrinsic superiority. Right? The real problem is they want it because that's what everybody else wants. It's the fashion aspect of it that he really disapproves of. So like I said, he's no ascetic. It's fine to want good things and things that make you happy. But you should want them because they're good things and things that make you happy, not because you're trying to prove to everybody else that you're a sophisticated person who, drinks nothing but the best claret. So I think the way out of the paradox is there's an appropriate kind of wanting for each of us. And in the end, and I didn't bring this up, what makes it appropriate is partly that we want it for the right reasons, and that has to do with its satisfying our appropriate natural desires. And like I said, there's no Puritanism about this. There's a wide range of appropriate natural desires. He's a little dubious about alcohol. Occasionally he says things like, well, given that people have to drink, why don't they drink beer? On the other hand, the comparison of the virtues of French and Italian wine suggests he was not, as is actually abundantly clear from lots of evidence, a teetotaler himself. I'm gonna do a graduate student and then you, Ralph. Sorry, Sajja.
Yeah, so you
you claim that Berkeley has this sort of broader project for bringing about happiness for everyone, and he has this big moral project, and his metaphysics and epistemology is geared toward that.
Yeah.
And I want to know more about how that's supposed to work, because, I mean, there's a lot of other philosophers in the period who make this sort of claim. Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, a lot of early modern philosophers say this sort of thing, but for them, you actually have to do the metaphysics and epistemology in order to become virtuous, in order to become happy, in order to become moral. But it's not exactly clear how that's supposed to work for Berkeley, because if he's actually discouraging from people from doing philosophy...
He's not discouraging them, but
okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just not exactly clear what... I see how one of the aims is to restore the epistemic innocence, but I'm not exactly clear how Berkeley's metaphysics and epistemology is actually supposed to help people become happiness, become happy. Yeah.
Okay, so first, I think I just need to acknowledge that there was supposed to be a part of this talk, Berkeley's theory of happiness, right? And it doesn't exist yet. So I want to acknowledge the genuineness of the problem that a bunch of people have come at from various sides here, right? So first, I should have done that earlier, but it's fun. It's not just fun; it's instructive to me, and you guys really are here to help me to see how far I can go without acknowledging the problems. And I think I learned a little ways, but not far enough. But I think there's a couple of things that make Berkeley different and more interesting in this regard. Is first, Berkeley really was obsessively engaged in one project, one improving project after another, right? The M&E stuff was just one little bit of the many and various things that he did in his life, and we haven't talked about all of them, right? We haven't even discussed tar water. Right, which, by the way, was another. He thought he'd found a universal cure for illness, and he promoted it with all the vigor that would be appropriate if one had found a universal cure for illness. And he wrote a whole long and weird book about how it worked. And I think if you read the book, it's the same kind of theme. And so one of the things we have in the case of Berkeley that we don't have in the case of these other guys is all these attempts to make the world a better place in different ways. And so we're not just, looking at the abstract philosophy and saying, well, of course, he thought that was going to make the world a better place. We can see how Berkeley thought you should go about making the world a better place in general, right? Because he tried it in a lot of different ways. And so I think there's a richer context to interpret this boilerplate. And also, I think because of that richer context, there's more reason to take the boilerplate seriously in Berkeley's case. I think he really meant it, right? It isn't just some, the kind of thing that you think up to satisfy the granting agency, right? Which they didn't have granting agencies back then, but they had similar motivations for putting those. And so I think there is this worry that when you read these grandiose prefaces, that's just, that's there to satisfy the social virtue part of what the NSF requires these days, right? The broader impacts part of your grant application. But since Berkeley really did actually all these things again and again, I think there's more reason in his case to think that he actually meant it, right? That he actually really believed in those broader impacts. They weren't just boilerplate, right? So that was part of your question, but now I've lost. There was something else you said that I really wanted to respond to. Is how is it working, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the thought was for a lot of these other philosophers, you have to first learn metaphysics, you have to learn epistemology,
right,
in order to become moral. But if in the end your common sense is perfectly fine,
right,
then I'm not clear on why do we need the metaphysics and epistemology in the first place if we want to become moral. Why not? I mean, so I'm wondering how the moral theory and metaphysics and epistemology hooks up if in the end we just need the common sense.
Right.
So yeah, it seems like there's this difference between someone like Descartes and Berkeley here. So, yeah,
okay, so I'm gonna give two answers, and I think Berkeley actually would have given both answers. I think these Berkeley had two answers to that question. And at first they're going to sound incompatible, but then, and I think we've touched a little on some of these issues already. The first is you don't need the philosophy, right? That the project is some people have unfortunately done some philosophy and done it badly and mucked things up. And all Berkeley is doing is trying to undo that damage. So if people hadn't mucked it up, then there would have been no need for Berkeley to do his thing. That's part of, and I think that's actually a real part of the answer. I do think he, for the illiterate bulk of mankind, or for those, sorry, that doesn't apply to them because they're not exposed to philosophy. For people like his lawyer and good friend Tom Pryor, who was not much of a philosopher but a serious Irish reformer, Pryor had trouble actually getting through Berkeley's philosophical books. I gave him worthwhile feedback on the Querist, but the Principles of Dialogues not so much. And his friend and patron Percival struggled mightily with the Dialogues and put off reading it forever. And Berkeley kept saying, "What do you think? What do you think?" And Percival's like, "Well, I've been really busy." And I think Berkeley probably thought for people like that, it would just been better if they'd never learned any philosophy. So I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's the whole of it. Because Berkeley also saw that, that the presentation of this exciting and useful science was intimately wound up with the philosophical ideas that he rejected. So if you look at Cartesian and Newtonian science, they're presented in ways that combine the philosophy he disagrees with science that he would really like to be able to take advantage of. And you can't master the science without being a philosopher. So I think that's the way he thought about it, that you actually can't master that science and understand it correctly without engaging in philosophy. And so for people that are going to do that stuff, they have to know the philosophy. And not just, so they couldn't be uncorrupted because you need to be taught that science in a way that incorporates the correct philosophical underpinnings. But the illiterate bulk of mankind, they don't need that science, right? So they can go and grow their potatoes just fine, right? And by the way, that's not meant to say that they can't improve in agriculture, but that you don't need the science to make the improvements. Berkeley goes on at great length about our ability to recognize important regularities in the world and connect them and make better choices as a result of attending to the regularities in our experience. That's the part of Berkeley where he just sounds, almost like Hume. And everything the ordinary people need to do, they can do in that way. But the mechanics gives us new tools that takes us beyond the kind of surface regularities, but we need to be able to think about those in the right way to avoid the dangerous consequences. And those tools, as it were, come in such a way, their form is such that you can't master them without some philosophy, and it better be the right stuff. So that's why I want to give two answers.
Well, I think maybe we can continue this informally and get the right answer in the reception. Let's thank David for this talk.
This is 4 minutes fast.